Well, good morning, Countryside Church family. Do you ever get to spend any time on the water? And well, if you do, you're fortunate because it's a good time to be on the water. You ever get to spend any time in a boat? You know, Jesus spent a lot of time in boats. The Bible records that Jesus spent time in boats. Sometimes he would be there and be preaching. And sometimes Jesus would be taking a nap in the boat. The Bible tells us there was a time when Jesus was out and the water was really, really rough. And Jesus stood up after looking around and calmed the storm, made the water calm, just like it is right here behind me. You know, Jesus spent a lot of time in boats. And in some ways, if you want to be more like Jesus, well, maybe you just need to spend more time in a boat. Well, when you think about it, there are lessons that we can learn when we spend some time in a boat. And one of the lessons that's really important to learn is that boats are made to float. Several years ago, my wife and I, we had a boat, and we enjoyed spending time on that boat. And boats have a plug in the back of them. They have a plug in the back of them so that if you're out boating all day, you can pull that plug out and let all the water that has jumped into the boat when you've jumped in and out of the boat all day. And so you take the boat out, you take the plug out of the boat. And one time we went and backed our boat into the lake, and we had forgot to put the plug in. And we had made our way off from the dock, and we were out for just a few minutes and noticed that the back of the boat was starting to get a little bit saggy, and we turned around and looked. Sure enough, we forgot to put the plug in. And what that meant is that everything that was outside of the boat trying to get inside of the boat that wasn't supposed to be on the outside of the boat getting inside the boat was getting inside the boat. Boats are made to float. And that means that there's stuff that's on the outside of the boat that you're trying to keep on the outside, and you're trying to stay above those things that are trying ultimately to drag you down. You know, a boat is supposed to float. And there's all that water out there trying to get on the inside. And the church is supposed to be like that. A church is supposed to rise above all those things that are out there. The culture is ultimately trying to drag us down. We can drown in the culture, but the church is supposed to rise above. In fact, Jesus talked about that with his own disciples. He said that even though we are in the world, we're not supposed to be of the world. In fact, what Jesus said in John chapter 17, verse 16, is Jesus said they are, talking about his disciples, he says, they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Jesus said that. Jesus understood that the church, even though it's surrounded by lots of water, it's supposed to stay above the water, it's supposed to float. But the question then becomes, well, if the church is in fact in the culture, just like a boat's in the culture, how do you respond to it? How do you react to it? What are you supposed to do if we're in the middle of it? When it comes to the culture, some people just want to condemn the culture. They just want to say everything that is out there is bad and evil, and we need to stay away from it to the very best of our ability. Other people want to isolate, separate. They want to stay far and far away. They want to keep their kids out of the fray of the world. They don't want them to know anything about the world. They want to pull them back, maybe even homeschool them. Don't let them be exposed to anything worldly whatsoever. Other people want to embrace the world, and they want to say, I'm okay, you're okay, everything is okay, everybody can do whatever they want to do, and the world is just fine. Some people react to the world that way. Other people, they ignore it. They put their head in the sand and they say, the culture is out there, but I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm going to ignore it. I don't have to make any changes, and nobody else has to make any change, so they ignore it. What is the church supposed to do with the culture? I believe that the church is supposed to leverage the culture. not isolate and not hunker down. The church is supposed to rise above the culture. It's supposed to float. It's supposed to float. But I think that the church is supposed to leverage the culture. We find things that are popular in the culture, that people understand and relate to and know well in the culture, and we grab a hold of those things and we leverage them, we use them in order to help bring people into the church. The church is supposed to be above the culture. It's supposed to float. Sometimes churches can have a leak, and they let way too much of the culture in, and they begin to sort of take on water, if you will, and they begin to sink. A church is supposed to rise above the culture. It's supposed to leverage the culture. It's supposed to invite people into a boat so that people don't drown. That's what the church is supposed to do. Lessons we can learn in a boat. Boat's supposed to float. Several years ago, my wife and I had an opportunity to go over to a friend's house. It was a small gathering of people from our church, and our friend, they had a really nice lake house, and they bought the place, and it had a little boathouse, and inside the boathouse was a little old 16-foot pontoon boat, which is about as small of a pontoon boat as you can get. And Jim escorted us all out the back, and we went down some steps down to the dock and into the boathouse, and we one by one started to get on this little thing. I think it only had a capacity of about 8 people. And he would take one of us right up front in the front right side and say, okay, you sit here and you stay right here. And then he'd take the next person right up to the front and right up front left. Now you stay right here, and you really can't change seats. And then there was a seat behind that one. And he'd take somebody up there and sit right here. And then when everybody got on the boat, he would say, now, if anybody needs to stand up or move around, we need to talk about that before somebody can go to the next place, because this is a little boat and it will start to rock and roll pretty hard. And so everybody, if you can just kind of stay still in your seat, it's best for everybody to enjoy the ride. Well, the boat I'm in right now, it's not 16 feet. I think it's about 36 feet. But if I get up here and I start kind of going like this, I don't know if you'll be able to see that or not at all, but I can make this boat even begin to rock. Another lesson we can learn from a boat is nobody really likes a rocking boat. Everybody seems to enjoy calm waters. Nobody really wants it rough. But truth is that there were times when Jesus would use a rocking, rough boat to teach. And one of the times that Jesus did that with his disciples is they were out in the waters, and you read about it in the book of Mark. In the book of Mark, chapter 4, verses 37 and 38, it tells us that a furious squall came up and that the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped, and Jesus was in the stern and he was sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up and they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" And Jesus used that rocking boat to teach them. He wanted them to know that he could calm the storm. He wanted to teach them that they should have more faith, because sometimes the waters are rough, but he's still there. Jesus, he taught that in a boat. Maybe you can remember that God used a rocking boat to teach Jonah. Remember, God tells Jonah, "Hey, I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to teach people about me." And Jonah said, "I don't want to do that." And so he went down to the bay there and gets in a boat and starts heading to Tarsus. And while he was on the way there, God sends a big storm, and all of the guys were nervous and afraid because of the big storm that was there. And they wake up Jonah and they say, "Jonah, what's going on here?" And Jonah says, "Well, the reason this big storm is going on is because I'm running from God." And so they threw him overboard, and God provided a big fish to swallow him up and take him over to the shore 3 days later and spit him out. But the lesson was the same. The lesson was there. He knew it right when he was in the middle of that rocking boat. You can't run from God. You can't run from God. And so God used a rocking boat. Nobody likes a rocking boat, but God used that rocking boat to teach Jonah. You can't run from him. You can't hide from him. Might as well go with him. Another time we see that the Apostle Paul, he was being escorted. He had been arrested and he was being escorted to, they're going to take him and put him on trial, but he was in a boat and they were taking him to where they thought he needed to be, and God sends a big storm, and you read about it in the book of Acts, chapter 27, and in verse 31 it says, "Then Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers," he says, "unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." And so in the middle of the storm, this time they had to ride the storm out. They had to stay in the boat. And maybe there's a lesson there that sometimes when things are rocking, that's not the time to jump ship. Just because the waters are a little bit troubled and a little bit rough, maybe there's a lesson that can be learned there for all of us, is that sometimes we just have to ride out that storm and stay with Jesus. So lessons we can learn in a boat is nobody really likes a rocking boat, but God can use a rocking boat. And sometimes the church just wants to stay in calm waters. And sometimes somebody might want to rock the boat of the church a little bit. And sometimes you start rocking the boat a little bit in the church, and somebody will grab a hold of you real quick, and they'll want to escort you right over here and say, "Well, why don't you sit down right over here and stay right here, because nobody really likes a rocking boat." But well, sometimes the church needs to be rocked a little bit. Sometimes there's changes that need to be take place, and there's some things that need to get pushed around, and because the church has a job. There are a lot of people in the culture that are drowning in the culture, and we're the ones that need to pull up alongside them and help get them up into the boat. And sometimes there's changes that need to be made, and God can use all of that. And God can use a rocking boat even though it makes us uncomfortable sometimes. So lessons that we can learn in a boat. Boats are made to float, rise above. And boats, when they're rocking, a lot of times can make people uncomfortable. And one more lesson that we can learn from boats is that boats need a healthy motor in order to move forward. They need a healthy motor to move. You get a boat like this one behind me here, or the big boat like this one behind me here. It's probably got two big V8s in it that push that thing down the water. Maybe you climb into a pontoon boat that's something like this, and it's not going to have two big V8s in it, but it might have an outboard motor on it, and the outboard motor might kind of look like that one right down there. And here's what's interesting about every one of these boats. All these boats need a healthy motor to move forward, but there's an integral part inside of every boat that has to be in place in order for it to work properly. Do you know what that part is? I hope you can see that part right down there. Most people would recognize that part down there as a propeller. A propeller. Every boat needs a propeller, right? But you know what the propeller does, right? It propels the boat. And you can see it just kind of sticking out right back there on that outboard out there. But the propeller's made to make it go forward. But I'm not talking about the propeller. Did you know that every boat motor, not only does it have a propeller, it has an impeller. Do you know what the impeller does? The impeller, your boat won't go anywhere if the impeller's not working. The impeller is a part inside the motor that draws water up from the lake or the river, and it circulates through the motor to cool the motor. And it's sometimes it can only that tiny little guy like that. Sometimes if it's a V8, maybe it's that big around, and maybe it'll even have a couple of them inside of there. But if your boat doesn't have an impeller inside the motor, well, your propeller's not going to get you anywhere. Well, that's kind of like you and I. We can propel ourselves around, but we want to make sure that we have a healthy impeller. Having a healthy impeller, really what that means is having a spirit-filled life. The book of Ephesians chapter 5 verse 18 says, "Be filled with the Spirit." And in the original language, the word be filled, the Greek word, is in what was called a continuing action. That means to be continually filled with the Spirit. It's kind of like that impeller on the boat. It never stops drawing clean, fresh water into the motor and cooling it off. That's the way we're supposed to live our Christian walk. We're supposed to be ever breathing in and taking in the Spirit of God. And we do that by reading our Bibles and spending time in prayer and spending time in fellowship with other brothers and sisters that are in Christ that help us to be filled in the Spirit, and listening to Christian music that helps us be filled with the Spirit, and that we put more of the Spirit of God in us, because when we are putting more of the Spirit of God in us, from out of that overflow of the Spirit is when we can be motivated, and where we draw motivation to do what Jesus wants us to do and to share Him with other people. The culture that we are in is getting further and further away from God, but it keeps creeping into everything around us. And the church is supposed to rise above that. And we're supposed to rise above that as believers in Jesus Christ. Sometimes we want our lives to be so calm and so smooth, but maybe God wants us to have our life rocked a little bit, that we can share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And He wants us to be healthy and able to move forward, just like a speedboat that goes flying across the water. It needs a healthy engine, and God wants us to have a healthy internal spiritual life and be connected to Him. There are certainly lessons that we can learn in a boat. I hope that before the snow starts flying, maybe you get an opportunity to go out and spend some time on the water and be in a boat. And while you're doing that, you just be reminded that God is alive and well and wants to work inside of us. Listen, one last thing. So I'm down inside this boat, and this boat is just absolutely surrounded by water on every side. And have you ever considered having the water surround you on every side? Have you ever considered being baptized into Christ? It's what Jesus wants you to do. The way that you show Jesus that you are committed to Him is you're baptized. You lay down into that water, and you rise again, and you put your old self behind, and you come back up, and you're out, and you're clean, and you're forgiven. And have you ever been baptized? Jesus would want you to do that. If you have been baptized and you are a follower of Jesus Christ, just take these lessons that we learned from the boat today, apply them to your life, and share them with others. And I look forward to being with you all next week. God bless.